This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Yael Berda.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. Our guest today is a professor of Jewish history at Harvard University and one of the leading scholars in the field of Israel studies. He has authored numerous books, most notably Theodor Herzl, the Charismatic Leader, that came out in 2020 and featured on the Tel Aviv Review. And his most recent one, Zionism, An Emotional State, is forthcoming by Rutgers University Press. Professor Derek Penslar, hello and welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
It's very nice to be back. Thank you.
So your main argument in the book is that Zionism is an emotion or a bundle of emotions rather than, or not only, an ideology or a political movement. So is the book a work of history or social psychology or perhaps an attempt to combine the two?
Well, it's a work of history, and it's very much in conversation with a flourishing field known as the history of emotions, which goes back in some ways 50, 60, 70 years, but really became a discipline in the past 20 years or so. And it's a field that then draws on psychology and sociology and even political science and international relations. Everyone's interested in emotion. We all know that it matters, and yet historians have been slow to figure out exactly what it means and why it matters. And I think that when you write a book about a political movement, particularly any kind of national movement, the essentiality, the centrality of emotion is obvious. And it's really kind of startling that historians have taken this long to get around to focusing on it.
So what's the added value of a historical perspective on emotions?
Well, the first thing is that emotions, like everything in history, are subject to change, and that emotions are socially constructed, certainly the way we articulate them, and that emotions, they change over time. So, for example, in the national movements of the 1800s, when Zionism began, it was very hard to separate the aspiration for national liberation from the need for individual liberation. And the feelings of hope and optimism and solidarity, the whole raft of positive emotions, were inseparable from nationalism. And that might come as something of a surprise to particularly people on the left in the 21st century who associate nationalism with domination, racism, exclusion, and a whole host of negative emotions, fear, hatred, resentment, and so forth. In a way, I think the only people today writing about nationalism in a politically sort of positive sense are people on the right wing of the spectrum. For example, in this country, there are some people who write about Zionism as a wonderful form of, ethnic nationalism, but this is actually a kind of an excuse for justifying a dominating and exclusive nationalism. But in fact, Zionism as it originates is tied up with a very different set of feelings, largely an aspiration for dignity and honor, which makes sense given the situation of the Jews in the late 19th century. So if we have a historical lens, we realize that emotions are extremely powerful. They change over time. Some dominate, some are subordinate. The emotional world we're living in now regarding Israel is just categorically different from the case 50, 80, 100 years ago.
I want to ask you about the materials that you use to kind of figure out what is the emotional landscape that you're talking about. What does it mean to understand emotions of a political movement or in regards to a political idea?
Well, I think emotions are actually central, and there is a false dichotomy that we all live with, I think, in our everyday speech. We talk about the distinction between feeling and thinking. There is no distinction. The human brain is constantly informed by somatic, that is bodily sensations, and by the secretion of hormones and so forth. Our allegedly rational thoughts are informed by certain goals, needs, desires, and so emotion actually is everywhere in whether it's the day-to-day encounters we have with other people or whether it's the structure of a political movement. How can we imagine any kind of political life without the relationship between negative emotions like fear, hatred, and so forth, which all have to do with some kind of desire, something you want that you haven't gotten or you're afraid you won't get, or then the emotions that I call positive emotions, the emotions of hope, love, happiness, and so forth. These are just fundamental to Zionism and to any other political movement. So for me, the question is not, how does emotion figure into this story? It's that emotion is actually the most important aspect of it. And we've been looking at it backwards or through the wrong side of the microscope.
The interesting thing, what you're saying about the connection between emotions and political ideology, nationalism, it's almost a given. I think that everyone, wasn't, even the early theorists of nationalism, whether Benedict Anderson or Ernest Gellner, have been talking about the role of emotions in all that. But I think that with regards to Zionism, the really important thing, or perhaps the exceptional thing, is that Zionism is sort of like measured against other analytical categories or historical phenomena that it is associated with, be it religion, Jewish religion as an emanation thereof, or colonialism, which is a relationship that needs unpacking, and also, of course, in relation to anti-Semitism. How does that figure into the analysis?
Well, all nationalisms are distinct. Zionism, one could say that Zionism's difference is different, but they are all distinct. They all have particular qualities. In the case of Zionism, yes, there's a religious heritage, and there is an emotional language from that heritage, particularly the language of love, with words like ahava or chiba, which is the Hebrew word that connotes a kind of gentle, endearing, and cherishing kind of love, the love for the land of Israel. And all of this is baked into the Jewish textual tradition. But what Zionism does in the 1800s is it romanticizes and modernizes that language. So when you read the poetry, for example, written by early Zionists, or the historical writing by early Jewish nationalists, they are actually much closer to German or Polish or Russian romantic poets or the great romantic historians of the era than to the Jewish textual tradition. So we shouldn't be, as it were, taken in by the superficial similarities between what Zionists write and, they're talking about biblical love of Israel. This is something very different. There's even direct comparisons, I think, between some of the early Zionist hymns that I write about in the book and famous German romantic poems of the time. Okay, so that's the late 1800s. And then as Zionism changes in the 1900s, the state is created, and again, emotions are socially constructed. We get a very powerful and different form of emotionality that's not really connected to the Jewish tradition. So, for example, the role of eros. Now, there is an erotic element in the Hebrew Bible. We have the Song of Songs, and we have the Song of Songs. In other words, everyone goes back to this one text. Whereas the Zionist movement, certainly from the 1920s and 30s onward, is just suffused with eros. It's everywhere in the ideal figure of the kibbutz male, muscle-bound, and particularly in images and propaganda images and films. It's very homoerotic, but also the sexualization of female bodies. There's an image, a photograph that was shown a lot in the United States in the 1940s in fundraising that shows a Palmach fighter, a woman wearing very short shorts with her legs kind of splayed, and she's holding a rifle. And, you don't have to be Freud to figure this one out. It's a very sexualized image. And then this happens.
And from that to Gal Gadot, it's sort of the same language.
To Ari Ben Kanan, to Exodus, the novel of 1958, which was a huge bestseller. And then from that to the hero worship of 1967, and onward, yes, unto Gal Gadot. So,
who is Wonder Woman?
Yes.
I
should say that.
Wonder Woman.
Yes.
So the eroticization of Zionism is something that goes way beyond whatever role of eros had existed in the Jewish tradition.
I just want to touch upon, you mentioned posters and pictures,
right,
and also collection boxes and different other artifacts that you use. So how intentional is that? I'm always interested in is this, because we don't talk about the presence of emotion, how much Is it just ingrained in the kind of ideas people had that they wanted to convey? And how much is intended to create a particular symbol or create a particular emotional connection?
Well, the history of emotions is inseparable from the history of senses and sensibility, which is also a kind of interesting new historical field, the history of sight and smell and hearing and so forth. And in a national movement, again, the sound of music, the national hymn, is just as stirring as, let's say, the lyrics. Why is Hatikva so popular? Why did it become the Zionist national hymn? Was it because of the words? In part. Also the melody. So hearing matters. Obviously, vision, the image matters enormously. Why was Theodor Herzl so influential and successful? Because he looked the part, right? The image of Herzl. When you look at Zionist fundraising posters for the Jewish National Fund or for the Karen Hayesod or whatever, and they show images of an idealized new Jewish body or an idealized landscape. These images are carefully chosen. And sometimes it's a combination of text and images. The way the text is presented, if it's in blood red letters screaming at the reader, they're trying to get your attention. They're trying to evoke certain emotions. The propaganda films that I also looked at in preparation for the book are obviously conveying emotions, not only in the speech, but also in the imagery of suffering Jewish immigrants baking in the hot sun of their tent cities and so forth. So you cannot study emotion, I think, by looking at text alone. Imagery is essential. And so the sources I use for the book are quite eclectic, ranging from films to photographs to posters, but again, to newspapers and all kinds of textual sources and archival sources as well, because you need everything if you're going to get at emotion.
What about the founding fathers and like the leading ideologues and politicians of the Zionist movement? Were they somehow in tune with this language of emotion? Did any of them ever reflect on that, or maybe try to manipulate emotions consciously for their political ends?
Well, I don't think that the founders of Zionism, like any great political leaders, they tend not to be in touch with their feelings. And they tend to be remarkably unself-aware. That's actually a characteristic of great political leaders, is that they combine enormous acuity and astuteness in judging others, and they actually don't understand themselves very well. I think it's true for Herzl, for Weizmann, for Jabotinsky, for Ben-Gurion, and so forth. So of course, they're emotional beings, but they don't really reflect on their own emotionality, and I wouldn't expect them to. So what's perhaps more important from our perspective is that we then retrospectively examine them. What we also see is that they create language, which clearly is meant to appeal to and to resonate with an audience. But I have to push back a little bit about the concept of manipulation. It's one thing I write about in the book, is that scholars like to say that leaders manipulate the public when the public response is something the scholar doesn't like. But if it's something the scholar does like, then they have agency. Well, I'm sorry. I think people actually have a great deal of agency, and that when a leader, whether it be Herzl or Lahavdil, the current prime minister, say things in a certain way, they indeed are intending to evoke a certain emotional message. But unless there is a predisposition on the part of the individual to hear that message, it will not resonate with them. So I really think that in a way my book, although it focuses largely on elite discourse, to the extent that I do find non-elite discourse, it's trying to restore agency to individuals. They don't always make the right choice. People often make bad choices. But I'm a little skeptical, whether it's in the current political situation in Israel or in other situations throughout history, of the concept of manipulation. I think it really needs to be unpacked. And it's something I try to do in the book.
Yeah, but also, now that you perhaps preempted a question that I wanted to ask down the line, but still, your previous book about Herzl dealt with his, Herzl, the charismatic leader, dealt with his, perhaps not emotions, but his mentality, and,
Right.
and made a very original claim about Herzl's role in history, and I encourage our listeners to read the book and also go back to the previous interview with you and listen to it. Is this current book perhaps an emanation or an expansion of the previous book? Is this what gave you the kernel of idea?
You're absolutely right. It did, because, again, it's not that Herzl understood his own emotions. He was really one of the most unself-aware people I've ever encountered. But I got interested in his individuality. I was interested in his psychology. But then I realized this is not just about Herzl. It's not just about a handful of leaders. So in the book, my sources include hundreds of journalists, activists, writers, rabbis, people who create these images for the Jewish National Fund or for the United Jewish Appeal. There is just a whole corpus of huge numbers of people who are either feeling powerful emotions that connect them to Zionism, or they are trying to create or at least magnify those emotions, whether the emotion be one of solidarity with the Jewish national product, which I write about a lot in the early chapters, various forms of love. And it's a very interesting thing, by the way, that the notion of loving Israel does not appear in American Jewish public discourse in the 1940s, 50s, and really until after 1967. They don't talk about love. They talk about solidarity and care and support. It's almost more like parents, the way they feel about their children. Then comes 1967, and suddenly everyone's in love with Israel, and people use that language. And even in our own day, the debate, do you really love Israel when you criticize Israel? No, you don't love Israel. So even love, which we take for granted, it's a biblical concept that exists today. Well, as I said earlier, no, it actually changes quite a bit. So the emotional needs of Jews, like everybody else, change over time. And the state of Israel is a source of great pride for many people. It's also increasingly a source of concern and worry for many people. So again, the emotions change over time. And I saw in Herzl, to get back to, the last book, I just saw one tiny sliver of a huge story, which I decided to unpack in this book.
I want to ask you about the different chapters of the book. So you have you have the loving, and you also have the hating.
Right.
And it's a chapter. I was even worried, even just the name of the chapter, you're kind of worried. Okay, what is this going to be about exactly?
Right.
And I was thinking about even that kind of emotion that we have about even talking about the issue for so many people is something that they can hardly articulate.
It is the hardest chapter. It was the hardest chapter to write. And maybe you notice it's the only chapter where I step out of my anonymity, as it were, as a scholar. And I say that this is the most engaged chapter. It's the most contemporary in its orientation. And it's because, it really matters. And because it's an ongoing story. Hatred is an ugly emotion. And yet it's obviously one of the most powerful emotions, along with fear and love. It actually binds people together in many ways, as well as tearing people apart. And as I show in the chapter, there were, at least in the earlier history of Zionism, there were people who actually glorified hatred. Menachem Begin wrote in his memoir or his autobiography, The Revolt, he wrote about the glory of hatred, not in the hatred of Jews and not the hatred of Arabs, but the hatred of the British, because he was a classic, in a way, 19th century nationalist. You hate the oppressor because the oppressor is denying you dignity and freedom. I don't know what he really felt about Arabs. I just know that publicly, he did not hate them. And that's a very interesting aspect of the chapter, is that, again, regardless of what people in the state of Israel felt about each other, until very recently, it was not considered appropriate to publicly express, in the Jewish public, to express hatred of Arabs. It became much more fashionable in recent years. But it wasn't, say, when Meir Kahane was the sole member of the Kach party, back in the 80s, he was considered beyond the pale because of his overt hatred. We live in a different emotional regime now. People can express hatred. And similarly, hatred of Zionism. There are ways now that people talk about their hatred of Jews, for example, but they know it's not fashionable to be anti-Semitic. So I'm being careful what I say here, because there are times where people are very hostile and critical of Israel and they're not anti-Semitic at all. But I think there are times, and I show it in the chapter, obviously, where people are couching a socially unacceptable hatred of Jews in the language of hatred of Israel. So the emotion of hatred, it exists, it's extremely powerful, and it does make all of us uncomfortable because we're always worried, I think, that the person we're going to be reading or talking to is a fanatic and is going to describe some kind of feeling that we think is genuine, like our criticism of the state of Israel. They're going to describe that as hatred. You hate Israel, or you hate Jews, or so forth. And it's like we want to defend ourselves against the charge of being hateful people. And yet, in fact, I think hatred is something that has to be understood as a natural, although usually unhealthy, human emotion. And there are ways of understanding when very hostile, critical language about any group, could be Jews, could be Israel, whatever. There are times where it is definitely hateful, and there are times when it doesn't cross that bar. So one thing I do in the book is I draw on the psychological literature. What is hatred? What does it mean to hate someone as opposed to be very critical of someone? What's the difference between hatred and anger? You can be angry at someone and not hate them. Just talk to anybody who's been married for a while. So I separate these emotions that all get tied together for us to better understand when it is that negative feelings about the state of Israel are genuinely hateful and when they're not. And if they are hateful, why they are hateful.
A more interesting distinction in that regard, I think, is really between loving and liking. I mean,
Right.
Hatred, in this sense, seems to me, semantically at least, closer to love.
Right.
I mean, you can love someone, but not necessarily like them, right? But,
Sure.
like your, I don't know, a next of kin or something, right?
Sure.
And when it comes really to kinship, and I think this is what lies really at the basis of Zionism and Zionist identification beyond the state of Israel, this distinction between hatred and love. I mean, perhaps not distinction, but perhaps they are the flip side of each other.
Well, they are. Catullus wrote this 2,000 years ago. Odi et amo. I hate and I love. They are psychologically connected. And what's interesting in the chapter where I talk about changing emotional connections of American Jews, let's say, and Israel, is that we know that among younger American Jews, the relationship with Israel is changing. It's not that love is turning to hate. That's not what's changing. What's changing is that a very powerful affective bond is cooling. Love is turning to like. Love is turning to, as my teenage daughter said many years ago, I asked her if she was a Zionist. She looked at me and she said, "I'm Zionish." In other words, a kind of cooling of sentiment and of affect. And so like is actually not an insignificant concept and then the opposite of liking would be a certain disappointment, bit of unease, concern. So these are, it's what Sean Nye calls ugly feelings. She's an affect theoretician who writes about feelings that they don't dominate your life, and you can't really change things when you have these feelings. They're just petty, small feelings. And I think what we see in the younger generations are feelings of, maybe a bit of distancing from Israel, not hatred, not total rejection, just a bit of maybe uncertainty, confusion, unease, disappointment, as opposed to what we're seeing now among those American Jews who have truly loved Israel. They're very unhappy about the current situation, and they're using the language, and I've noticed this all over the sort of world of Jewish public opinion. They're using the language of grief, and the word anguish is suddenly appearing. I've never seen that word outside of maybe the far left. But now even mainstream Jewish writers like Hillel Halkin are using the word anguish to describe their feelings about Israel. That's because they love Israel so much. So I think you're right. There's a distinction between hatred and love, between love and anguish, and then the other hand, this kind of cooler, softer emotional language, which probably is becoming increasingly dominant in North America, certainly among younger Jews.
And that is and that is really where the distinction between Zionism in Israel and diasporic Zionism really come to the fore. I mean, whereas in previous generations there was some sort of perhaps hierarchy, but still you could look at it as the same unit. Is this really a marker that is Israel and the diaspora, in relation to Zionism and perhaps beyond that, are drifting apart?
Well, they are, I don't know if they're drifting apart. It's certainly changing in that, again, there's a generational change. During the 1940s, 50s, 60s, I think that North American Jews in particular could view Israel sort of as a parent views a beloved child. And then I mentioned earlier that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was an erotic love. And it was a love where you are just infatuated with your partner and they can do no wrong, and you would never dare criticize them. I think what we're seeing now is more of an egalitarian relationship where young people, for example, my students, I mean, a lot of my Jewish students are connected to Israel. They go to Israel, they go to Tel Aviv, they work for startups. I mean, Israel is a part of their life, but it doesn't have the same kind of burning intensity that it would have had for a previous generation. Like I said, they don't love Israel. They love being in Israel. They like the beach in Tel Aviv. I think it's a much more, I think it's more of an egalitarian relationship, really for people under 40. And this is something that is so difficult when I speak in synagogues where the people who attend are usually quite a bit older. They're my age or older. I'm in my mid-60s and they're my age or older. And they say, why can't we get our young people to feel about Israel the way we do? And I say, well, of course they can't, because they're not you. And we live in an entirely different generation. And the state of Israel is entirely different. It's a totally new emotional structure. And they simply can't accept that.
But also, I'm sorry. No, the fact that the previous generation did not go to Israel, didn't see Israel as part of their daily life. For them, it was perhaps, a concept, an abstraction. How does that affect I mean, is this really what dictates the very different emotional response?
I don't think so, but I'll tell you why. It is true. More and more people go to Israel. What is it? I think almost half of Jews in North America have been to Israel. But they usually go only once, and they often go on an organized trip, which does not show them the complexity of Israel. It shows them a kind of a picture postcard of Israel. It's true that you can read about Israel in a way that you couldn't before. You can listen to the Tel Aviv Review. You can read the Israeli press online. People are more informed about Israel. But I think that ultimately, it's not the information, it's what you do with the information. So to the extent that there were North American Jews in the 70s who went back and forth, or the 80s, nonetheless, the Israel that they saw was the Israel they wanted to see. They were very well informed about Israel, but they were idealists. So I don't think it's just the nature of exposure to information that's changing the emotional connections with Israel. It's partly the changes within Israel itself, that Israel is a country whose flaws are increasingly glaringly obvious. But it's also huge generational changes among North American young people, the kinds of things that they care about, their political orientations, their identification with Black Lives Matter, with various causes of racialized and oppressed communities. They're seeing Israel through a different lens than people did in previous generations. Whether they're right or wrong is not the issue. So it's not just the availability of information, although that has, I agree with you, changed enormously.
So I wanted to ask you about the relationship between love and loyalty, and kind of what happens when, these young people are hearing about occupation and the settler colonialism and these concepts that are also widespread in the American context, but also in European context. And then something happens to the possibility of love as loyalty. So this is not just a generational thing, but it's also about what one can be loyal to within a range of. So, I'm interested in this kind of relationship between loyalty and the other emotions.
Right. Well, loyalty is connected with trust and with reliability and with the sense that the loyal person will never betray you, because you can't be betrayed by a stranger. You can only be betrayed by a friend. And I write about this in one of the chapters in the book. So when Jews in the United States began to really criticize Israel's occupation already in the 1970s with a short-lived group called Brera, which was absolutely blasted out of existence by the American Jewish mainstream, they spoke the language of love in order to be seen as loyal to Israel, but they were said, you're not loyal to Israel because you don't love Israel, because you're critical. So the demand for loyalty was always implicit. And the mainstream Jewish organizations in the early 21st century, for example, Hillel International put a statement out, I think in 2010, that criticism of Israel is tolerated as long as it is done from within love, which presupposes loyalty to the Jewish state. Well, what if your concerns about Israel are such that you think the country needs a radical regime change? What if you find the occupation so deeply distressing that you feel that drastic measures are called for? Well, then you can't use the language of loyalty. You're called disloyal to the state of Israel by people who are very sympathetic to the state. The real issue, though, for young people today, like my students, their generation, if they go to a liberally oriented university or college and they want to be part of a progressive political atmosphere, then they need to be loyal to that sort of milieu. And to be loyal to that milieu means to disavow Israel. So they're torn between two kinds of emotional connection. Are they going to be loyal to their progressive ideologies? Are they going to be loyal to their state, to the state of Israel, which in a way is loyal to their families, is all tied up with their parents and grandparents and so forth? And they're really torn. They're actually torn between two different kind of demands for loyalty.
What about, you finished writing the book in November 2022, so almost on the day of the last election where the current government came to power, the most radically right-wing in Israel's history, and we've seen what it's done in the last 4 months, and we dread to see what it will do in the coming months and years. How does that change the whole structure, the bundle of emotions when it comes to Israel, both at home, but I'm more interested in what's happening across the pond, in the sense that we talked about perhaps you weren't too happy with my use of drifting apart, but this cleavage within the American Jewish community with regards to Israel, might it be could the ranks be closed now with a more unified emotional response to what Israel has become, or the Israeli government has become?
Well, there clearly has been a sea change in the public voice of North American Jewry just in the last few months. As, again, the dominant language has changed from love to, again, grief, anguish, profound anxiety, worry, and so forth. And it's not the kind of anxiety that, let's say, might be expressed about Israel during a war, when Israel's being attacked from the outside. That is in some ways an anxiety or a worry that strengthens people. It strengthens their bonds with Israel. But now this is I think, a gnawing and deeply unsettling kind of anxiety that Israel itself is falling apart. And I'm in my engagement with the Jewish public in North America, I'm feeling this anxiety as never before. And people are willing to ask questions that they've never been willing to ask before. And when I ask them in turn, why are you so upset about these changes in the relationship between the judiciary and the executive and appointments of Supreme Court justices, why does this bother you so much? And what they realize is that they have an image of what they think Israel is as a certain kind of democracy, Western-style democracy. And they don't want to have to choose, talk about loyalty, between loyalty to Israel and loyalty to their, what are for most North American Jews, liberal values. There is a minority who are quite different, about 20%, who are very, very different in their views about Israel, much more right-wing. They've never had to really make that choice before. And then I bring to them, well, there's another issue here on the table about democracy, which is the occupation. And it's been going on for over half a century. And we're talking about millions of people who essentially have no rights and live under a different, entirely different political and legal system. And what I'm encountering among, again, even mainstream North American Jews is a little bit more of a willingness to acknowledge this and to see that the two are, in fact, connected. Now, I have to be gentle and careful about this because, again, I don't want to, and I don't personally believe in alienating my community. And I think it's wonderful that they care about the state of Israel and that they worry about it. And I don't want to simply say to them, well, you've been ignoring the occupation for 50 years. I mean, they really do care about the state. But they are feeling a new set of emotions, and they don't quite know what to do with them. The problem is that the mainstream leadership in North America, so AIPAC and its Canadian equivalent, CIJA, are simply denying there's a problem at all. and saying that there is a robust democratic debate going on, which is, I think, not really true. I mean, in short, there are three different ways that I see North American Jews now reacting to the crisis. One is denial. Everything's fine. It's a robust democracy. Elliot Abrams wrote this, and I think it was in commentary. Everything's fine, and people who are critical are, hysterical. He uses that word quite a bit. Okay. The other is denunciation and distancing, which is, I think, people who were already alienated from Israel are basically saying, see, I told you so. What I'm encountering, though, among the main bulk of the Jews with whom I'm in conversation, these are sort of Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist Jews who do affiliate with synagogues. They have some connection with Israel. They're not, unaffiliated and indifferent. A kind of determination. They want to engage. They just don't know how. There was a group I was talking to, and I said, well, here's a website, and you can give money if you want to support the demonstrations. But of course, the website is only in Hebrew, and saying, you people, you might want to put this in English for the, how many American Jews know Hebrew. So that's what I'm detecting, is unease, anguish, a desire to engage, and perhaps for the first time, a sense of determination that simply does not mean doing what the state of Israel tells them to do.
Because your book is about Zionism and the emotions around Zionism, and there's this thing between Zionism and the state of Israel,
right.
That relationship.
Right.
I'm wondering if this moment is not questioning their relationship with the state of Israel. The real anguish comes with the question, if this is happening in the state of Israel,
right?
What is my relationship, my emotional relationship to Zionism? And I think that's where the shever gadol, the big break, lies. And I want to ask you about that.
Sure. Well, the book is, although it's largely about emotion, it has sort of an introductory chapter where I talk about what does Zionism even mean and what has it meant throughout history and how those meanings changed. For most Jews in diaspora, to be a Zionist has been inseparable from their connection with the state of Israel. And I do think that it'll be very hard for them to break that connection. It's a psychological investment. It's also a financial investment and an institutional investment. Think about all the Jewish summer camps and the day schools and the gap year programs and the birthright program and all of these ways in which diaspora Jews have made Israel sort of central to their identity. So how are they going to, as it were, reconfigure what Israel means to them and think about Zionism in some possibly different way? Because Zionism for too long has simply meant supporting the state of Israel. Whereas Zionism in its original meanings, and I'm hoping we can get back to what Zionism was, more than 100 years ago, Zionism was an expression of Jewish collectivity and peoplehood. And there was some definite idea of connection with Eretz Israel, or else we wouldn't call it Zionism. But those connections were diverse and amorphous, and they could take many different forms, cultural connections, religious connections. And it would be really nice if we could, as it were, reclaim the diversity of Zionism and remove it from simply state veneration, which is what it's been for far too long. And I'm seeing some signs of that. But again, we have this word, Zionism, to describe attachment of some form with the state of Israel. And so people use that word because they don't have another word for it. And the word still has salience. So I do think that there are signs of questioning, perhaps moving in more complicated directions. But the power of inertia and of fear is very powerful. The fear of being seen as disloyal, to get back to your point, the fear of being outside of the tent, the fear of giving ammunition to Israel's enemies. I often hear that. And the fact that deep down inside, there's a sense that we, Jews in diaspora, cannot possibly understand what it's like to be in the state of Israel. And yet now we have hundreds of thousands, millions of Israelis saying, we need you. We need you and your values. Everyone in the Jews in the diaspora are always intervening in Israeli life in one way or another. We need you, and we need your values. So I don't think that the word Zionism itself is going to go out of fashion, but it may be infused with new meanings.
All that thanks to the radical right-wing government, or much of it. I'm saying, acting as an accelerator, perhaps.
Well, it's what Hegel called the cunning of history.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
One thing, because we haven't talked about Palestinians,
Right.
which is a very big part today of, at least for this government, what Zionism means, which means to exclude the possibility for Palestinians, both as a collectivity, as individuals with rights and whatever.
Or even as human beings, perhaps.
Even as human beings. And so when you read the coalition agreements, and I think that's it's an emotional document.
Mm-hmm.
Emotional
Interesting, yeah.
document in itself. What chapters would you have added to the book if you had that material as well?
Well, I think there's two strands here. One is that among the North American Jews and the Jewish communities I'm in contact with, there is actually, because of the crisis over the nature of Israeli democracy and the threats to what they think of as Israeli democracy, there is more awareness of and interest in Palestinians. And in a way, I feel that the timing isn't good because for many years, Palestinians have been keen to engage in dialogue with Jewish groups in order to promote Palestinian interests. But in recent years, out of frustration, disappointment, rage, a lot of Palestinians have simply given up. So in student groups, I just heard an interesting conversation at Berkeley where one Palestinian activist said, we really don't care what you Jews think anymore. You know, we're looking at trade unions and civil society, and we just don't really want to talk to you anymore. And I feel the timing is not great because now I am encountering North American Jews who want to talk to Palestinians. They want to understand. Now, maybe they should have been there a long time ago. Okay. But now they do. Well, who are they going to talk to? So I do feel like there's a bit of a kind of a disconnect there. As far as what chapters I would have added, I think clearly my book is largely about emotions that Jews feel about themselves, so positive emotions that they feel about themselves or negative emotions such as fear. But then when I write about hatred and betrayal in my final chapters, I'm really writing about the relationship between Jews and non-Jews. So what's missing from the book and has really just skyrocketed in recent months are intragroup dissonances. So, for example, hatred of Jews by other Jews. What we're seeing now in the state of Israel, where there are these polarized camps, and we don't know where that hatred is going to go. And then the sense of betrayal, where I recently gave a lecture about Israel feeling betrayed by the international community, and a very perceptive individual said, but what about the betrayal of diaspora Jews by Israel? He said, we feel betrayed. And that gets back to that expectation that Israel will be a certain kind of state, and it's not living up to that. So I would definitely have thought much more about intra-group negative emotions. So,
yeah, well, there's the second edition of the book might have that.
More things to write about.
Yes. Professor Derek Penslar, Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University and the author of the forthcoming book, Zionism, An Emotional State. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to you, Yael.
Thanks.
And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has well over 800 interviews. Like us on Facebook. Follow me and Yael on Twitter. And most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.